Welcome class, thank you for joining me for this review. I apologize that I'm not here to review for you for your quiz. However, if you watch this video, this will step you through everything you need to know to be successful on your upcoming quiz tomorrow. So, the first thing we are going to start with are these transformations. So, I want you to remember there are 4 different types of transformations we are going to be talking about. Now, for this first one, these first 2 questions, what I'm asking you to do is I'm giving you a function and then asking you to write me the equation given certain transformations. So we're starting with our parent function. Our parent function y equals the square root of x. And what are we doing to that function? Well, the first thing we're doing is we're moving it to the right 4. Now, remember, left and right means x values change, okay? Now, right is a negative change. Left is a positive change. So recall we discussed in class, this is a little bit backwards from what we would expect. Okay? So what ends up happening is right actually means we need to subtract 4 from the x. All right? So remember, moving it right and left means you're changing that x value. You're subtracting 4 from the x. Now, that's not the only thing that's happening though. We're also moving it down too. So remember to move it down. Remember up and down happens at the very end of the function, outside of manipulating that x. Okay? So down 2 would look like that, and this will represent that new function that is being described. So again, following those same rules, number 2, we're starting with y equals x cubed. And the first thing I see happening is left 3. Now remember, when we're shifting the x like that, when we're having that horizontal change, what's happening is actually left means positive. So this time the x is getting a positive shift of 3. So again, left and right is always influencing that x value. Now, going up 7. Up 7 again, that is happening at the end of the function, separate, and it's going back to the way we would normally think. We would normally think up as positive. So again, remember, this can be a little bit tricky, but so for the x changes, the horizontal changes, you do the opposite of what you'd expect. For the vertical changes, up and down, they happen at the end of the function by themselves, and it goes back to the way you would normally think of shifting the function. I'm sorry, went too fast. So for these next 2, what's happening in these 2 is now I'm asking you to describe for me what change is occurring. So you need to identify the changes that happened and to write them out for me. Now, I do expect you to use the precise terminology that we discussed in class and that I'm going to use in this video. So it's very important that you use the precise language that I am looking for. So the first thing I'm noticing is this multiplication. When you have that multiplication happening, what is occurring is a vertical stretch. And a vertical stretch of what? Well, that's a vertical stretch of 3. So whenever you have that multiplying action happening, that is going to be a vertical stretch of 3. And it is very important, you must put that first. That has to be your first step. So at the end where it says be sure to put them in proper order, you must reference the vertical stretch first, which is actually okay because when you're reading the function, it's typically the first thing you're going to come across. The next thing I notice is my x has 2 being subtracted from it, a minus 2. So first of all, whenever my x is being changed, that is horizontal. So this is a horizontal translation. And remember, in this case, it is the opposite of what we'd expect. That minus is actually referencing to the right. So horizontal translation, right 2. So you can shift it to the right. And then the last thing I notice is at the very end, separate from everything else, 4 is being added. So that 4 is actually moving the function up. So this is going to be a vertical translation. Now remember, when it comes to these vertical translations, the action is happening as we'd expect. So that plus 4 means simply up 4. And now our next one ends up operating exactly the same way, okay? We're going to go step by step, identifying those same pieces. The first thing I come across when I'm reading my function is that 4 that's multiplying it. So because of that 4, again, any multiplication, we know that it's talking about a vertical stretch. And in this case, what is our vertical stretch? Well, it's a vertical stretch of 4. The next thing that happens as I'm reading this is I see that plus 1 within the x. 1 is being added to each of my x values. So again, changing the x is creating a horizontal translation. And this is where the opposite of what you'd expect is happening. So that positive is actually a left motion. So it is a vertical or a horizontal translation left 1. And then finally, at the end there, the 7 is being subtracted off on its own at the end of the function. So when that's happening, remember that it's going to be a vertical translation. And when it comes to vertical translations, they act the way we would expect them to. So that is actually a motion down 7, just like the negative would make us believe. So those are 3 of the 4 transformations that we referenced in class. Remember, there was one more type. We can also reflect things over the x or the y axis. Now, this can get really tricky, okay? So there's certain things I need you to remember that I'm going to put on the board that I want you to write down on your sheet that you're going to have to study and memorize for tomorrow. So for the first one, find the function g of x that represents the reflection of f of x equals 3x minus 2 over the x-axis. So when you see an x-axis change, if you were to look in your book or if you were to look in the notes packet that I gave you, what is referenced when it's talking about the x-axis, you'll see this little note here, y equals negative f of x. Now, what that is telling you is in order to reflect something over the x-axis, you need to make your whole function negative. You take the opposite of the entire function. So when we're making that g of x, like it's telling us to, what ends up happening is we take the negative of the entire function. So that 3x becomes negative, and that negative 2 becomes positive. We take the opposite of the entire function, and that is going to flip it over your x-axis. So I really do want you to write this down because you're going to have to remember that one for your quiz. Now, on the flip side of that, for the y-axis, if you look at the same place in your notes or the table in the book, what it's going to tell you is this. And what that is telling you to do, in order to perform a reflection across the y-axis, you are actually only changing the x. That is telling you to put a negative in for the x only in your new function. So here, to create the g of x, what you are doing is putting a negative in only for the x value. Nothing else changes. So what happens when you do that? Well, you'll end up with a negative 4x, but the negative 5 doesn't end up changing because, again, for a y-axis flip, you are only going to change your x values. And this is one of those little details that I do need you to actually memorize for your quiz. Okay, so make sure you have those written down on your sheet here so you can reference and become familiar with that for tomorrow so you can keep them straight when you're answering these questions on the quiz. All right, the next type of question. We learned how to graph absolute values. Now remember, the first thing that's important with absolute values is identifying the vertex. That's the first thing that we're going to do. So remember, for the vertex, I look at that +1. Remember, positive is a left change. So what that means is my vertex is actually at -1. And then that down 3 motion, that -3 at the end, acts just like we would expect it to. So that is where my vertex is going to lie. It's going to lie -1, -3. And this is why it's important to understand transformations, because if you don't understand transformations, you wouldn't be able to properly find that vertex. Now, not only is that where the vertex lies, but that's also where my line of symmetry is. Now, the directions actually say to label that axis of symmetry. So the axis of symmetry, where is it occurring? Well, it's occurring on that line x equals -1. It's occurring at the vertex. And on your quiz, I do expect you to label that for me. There is an actual spot on the quiz where it'll leave a blank there asking for it. You need to label that it is a line x equals 1, because remember, vertical lines are always an x equals. Well, how do we finish graphing this thing? Well, now I need to hone in on that 2, because that 2 is indicating the slopes of the lines that are coming out of that. So I have my vertex, and now from that point, I need to create my slope of 2. Well, slope of 2, remember, you can consider 2 over 1. So it's telling me for a rise of 2, I have a run of 1. So rise of 2, run of 1. My next point is going to be right there. But remember, that's why I labeled my axis of symmetry. Because what ends up happening is now I get a mirror image of that point over here. I do my slope again, up 2 over 1 to get there. And again, what ends up happening is I create a mirror image on the other side of the axis of symmetry. Follow my slope again, up 2 over 1, puts me right there. I get my mirror image. Up 2 over 1, and I get my mirror image. Up 2 over 1, and I get my mirror image. And so now, this is going to be the complete set of points on our function. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to connect it so it's actually a line. And notice we got the shape that we needed. If you're graphing something and you don't get a V shape, clearly something happened and you should go back and look at it and fix it, okay? Because we know for a fact all these absolute values, we're talking about V shapes. Now, for number 8, we're talking about exactly the same thing. The first thing I'm going to do is I need to find my vertex. And recall, I get my vertex from looking at how is my x shifting. Well, remember, a negative shift there is actually shifting it to the right 2. So it's going to be at +2. And then that +1 at the end is showing my vertical shift. So my vertex is going to be at 2, 1, right there. And not only is my vertex there, but that is also where my line of symmetry is. So if I'm being asked to label my axis of symmetry, this time it's going to be on the line x equals 2. And to complete this graph, I need to follow that slope. So identify my 3, that vertical stretch. That is giving me the slope that I need to follow to find more points. So remember, 3 over 1, rise of 3, run of 1. So up 3 over 1 from the vertex would give me that point right there. And then that's not all I do. I have to mirror that image across the y, or the axis of symmetry. Follow my point again to get my next point. And once again, I'm going to mirror that image across to right there. I connect my lines, and there we have it. So again, importantly though, make sure you label your vertex and your axis of symmetry, and then also make sure you're getting a V-shape. If you somehow do not get a V-shape, that really means you need to go back and look at it again, because that means something went wrong when you were making your graph. After discussing absolute values, we moved into inequalities. So, to graph inequalities, well, number 9, you can tell, is linear. It is actually in standard form. Now, for lines, remember, we are usually comfortable graphing them in slope-intercept form. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract that 3x over, and then I'm going to divide by 4. So now I have an equation solved for y, because that's how we're most comfortable graphing. That's how we've learned how to graph for years, is we need the y by itself. Once we have the y by itself, what I need to do is now graph it. So I'm going to start at that -3. You always start at the y-intercept. And after you plot your y-intercept, now I'm going to use that slope of -3/4. Well, a slope of -3/4 means I go down 3 and over 4. So I get that point right there. Or I could do the exact opposite to get a point. Now remember, before I draw my line, I have to analyze. Is it going to be solid? Or is it going to be dashed? That's the next important thing for inequalities, is what type of line am I getting? Well, what I'm noticing here is it is less than or equal to. That or equal to piece means that this is in fact a solid line. So I'm going to connect them with my solid line. And now after I've determined that piece, the next thing I have to do is determine where is my shading happening. Well, I see y is less than that line. So to analyze where less than that line is, I start at any point. Less than means down. So in this case, we're shading that entire region that is underneath my line. So this whole area here is what ends up being our shaded region. So that is how you take care of graphing lines. Solve it for y, check to see if it's a solid dashed line, and check to see where the shading occurs. In number 10, this time, our inequality is an absolute value. So when looking at that, well, this time, if you recall graphing absolute values, the first thing I'm going to identify is my vertex. I absolutely have to find that vertex. That plus 3 that's there. That plus 3, what is happening is a shift to the left. Remember, plus means left. And that down 1 motion is shifting my graph down. So my vertex is at -3, -1. So it'll be right there. And now, once I've done that, that tells me that my axis of symmetry is right there. So as I'm using that slope of -2, I'm getting my other points by mirroring them over that line. Now, as I said, my slope is -2 here. So -2 over 1. So that's telling me is I go down 2 over 1. So I would get that right there. And I also get its mirror image. Down 2 over 1 again to end up right there. Then I get its mirror image. Down 2 over 1 again. And then I get its mirror image. All right, so that takes care of plotting the points. Now I can see the shape. Now it's important though, before I get too hasty and start filling it in, I need to see what type of line am I getting. Well, this time I'm seeing strictly greater than. Y is strictly greater than that absolute value. So what ends up happening? Well, if it's strictly greater than, that means all I'm getting is dashed lines. Okay, so in this case, do not give me solid lines, just give me dashed lines there. And now remember, for these, when I'm analyzing, where am I shading? I am analyzing starting from the vertex. So I'm going to start at the vertex, and it is telling me that my y is greater than that absolute value. So if I'm trying to be greater than the absolute value, greater means above. So that is telling me it is this whole outside region. Okay, because remember, for absolute values, it's either inside the absolute value or outside the absolute value. And in this case, it is that entire region that is outside that absolute value. All right, so you'd want to shade in that whole region there. Now, not only am I going to expect you to be able to create absolute values, I'm also going to have to ask you to make the equation of them. So what that means is you're going to have to know how to find the equation of a line, then how to determine how to write the inequality symbol. So I'm going to first focus on finding the equation of that line. So remember, the first element is slope. Well, what I'm seeing for a slope, I pick 2 points. In between those 2 points, what's happening? Well, I'm going down 2 and over 1. So that's telling me I have a slope of -2. And I have to identify the y-intercept. Well, the y-intercept in this one is up there, up at +4. So the y-intercept means I have a +4. So I've identified how to make that line, -2x plus 4. Now I have to determine the type of inequality sign to write there. I am seeing a solid line. So solid line means I'm looking at one of those. I also see that it is underneath my line that is being shaded. It's everywhere under the line. So being under the line means my y is going to be less than or equal to that line. And that is what I need you to be able to make. And for the next one, again, first thing I need to identify is slope. Well, it looks like I'm going up 1 and over 1. So up 1 and over 1 just leaves me a slope of 1. So I'm going to have 1x. And next I identify my y-intercept. Well, my y-intercept is up at 2, so I'm going to get my plus 2. So once I've identified that that is how I'm going to represent this line, now I need to determine my, my inequality sign. So this time I see a dashed line. Remember, dashed line means I'm getting one of those. Means that it is not or equal to, it is strictly greater than or strictly less than. And again, when looking at where this is, well, if I'm looking at my line, it's everywhere underneath my line that's being shaded. So remember, underneath the line means we are getting a less than symbol. And so this is how you're going to properly write that inequality. Now, not only am I going to have you write inequalities, we're actually going to go back and review some basic graphing skills. All right? So, if we're talking about basic graphing, looking at number 13. So, now number 13, sometimes this throws you guys for a loop because you don't see a y-intercept. But remember, really, if there's nothing there, isn't that the same as having plus 0? That 0 meaning origin. So recall, whenever you just have that y equals 2x, you just have the x term, but you don't have any constant with it, remember, all that's telling you is that you're starting at the origin. You have kind of a plus 0 there. Now, from there, you have a slope of 2, or as I like to think of it as 2 over 1. Rise of 2, run of 1. So, for each of these, rise of 2, run of 1. Rise of 2, run of 1. Rise of 2, run of 1. So you collect all those points. And now this is an equation. So for equations, all you have to do is make the line, and now you're done. All right? So when I ask you to graph these equations, all I want is that line. Don't confuse these with the inequalities. Okay? Equal sign means you're just giving me that line. 14. So here's one of those special cases that we talked about back on that graphing review day. For the special cases, I want you to remember a y equals means horizontal. Okay, that is giving you a horizontal line. And where's a horizontal line? Well, down at -1. Because those represent every point that has a y value of -1. If you ever have an x equals, remember that is giving you a vertical line because that vertical line represents every point that has an x value of 3. So I will tell you on your quiz, one of those special cases is going to appear. So you need to make sure that you remember that y means horizontal line, x means you're getting a vertical line. Now, the last question is going to ask you to do that regression line that I taught you to do on the graphing calculators. All right? So it is very important that you remember how to do this. So remember, when you are trying to find the regression line, the first thing you need to do is input the data. Now to input the data, remember, you go into stat, you go into edit, and then list 1 is going to be your X values. List 2 is where you put all of the Y values. Or in that case, the year is going to be the X, the value is going to be the Y. So remember those steps and how to get in there and make your data lists. Now, the important thing is also looking at the instructions. For the X's, you're not putting in 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006. Oh no. You are using X as a number of years since 2000. So to get more reasonable numbers, so you're not getting insanely huge numbers, that basically means this X you're using 2. That one you're using 3. This one you're using 4, 5, and 6. If on the quiz you don't follow instructions on if your X's are different than what you think, well, you put in the actual year, you're going to get a very different line, and you're going to get some different data happening. So just make sure that you read the directions carefully. X being the number of years since 2000, that means these are the numbers you should be using for X. All right? Now, after you input your data, you want to make your line. You want to make the regression line. Remember, to do that, you go back into Stat, you go over to Calc, and then you go down to what is called line regression, AX plus B. All right, so those are the steps to get you to the regression line. And when your data pops up, remember, the important thing is you remember how to put that data in the form of a line. So it is going to tell you A is negative 492.3, and it's going to tell you B is 20,933. And you need to turn that into this line. Y equals A times X plus that B value, that 2,933. So you must be able to turn that into this equation for me. Take the information your calculator gave you, make the line. Weak, medium, or strong. For that, you look at the R value. And in this case, the R value is negative 0.998. And if you remember, the closer you get to 1 or negative 1, the stronger the relationship. So this is giving us a very, very strong relationship. That is a nearly perfect relationship right there. All right. So, C, this is where you start actually having to do a little bit of math for these. Estimate the value of the car in 2011. So it is giving us an X value. It's giving us an X value of 11, and it wants to know the value of the car at that X value. So what you need to do is plug in 11 for X. Because 2011 represents an X value, and they want the value. They want the Y value. So when you plug that in, what you end up getting is in 2011, the car will be worth $15,517.70. And indeed, they're giving you the opposite information. Indeed, they're giving you a Y value. They're giving you a value of the car, 14,000, and they want to know in what year will that happen. All right, so we're looking for a year. We're looking for the X value, given the y value. So this time we're going to end up doing the reverse. So to look for x, I'm going to subtract off the 2,933. So you get negative 6,933 equals negative 492.3x. And we're going to divide by that negative 492.3. And that is going to give me about 14.08 equals x. So 14.08. Well, I'm not going to leave my answer like that because it's not really answering what year. If I want to relate that to a year, what that 14 point sum is telling me is in the year 2014, my car is going to be worth that $14,000. So indeed, make sure you can't just leave your answer as what X told you. You do have to put that back into year form for me. So that 14.08, that is referencing 2014. So thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Now, I know you're watching this in class right now. However, if you need to reference it again, you need to go back and check anything. What you can do is go on YouTube and Edmodo. I am posting this video there. So you will have access to it at home to continue studying tonight. Because now after going over this, you now know the pieces that you got wrong. And that should help guide you to what you need to study. What didn't you understand? Again, the best way to study from here is the pieces you didn't understand. Go back. Look at those particular notes in your packet. Go back, re-watch the original notes video. Go back, re-watch this notes video. So you have many, many resources to help you study for this upcoming quiz. So thank you for joining me. Good luck, and I will see you when I return.